It is my privilege and honor to introduce Quinn Read from the Center for Biological Diversity. Quinn Read is the Oregon Policy Director for the Center for Biological Diversity. She works to protect and restore Oregon's imperiled species and landscapes. Prior to joining the center, Quinn worked as the Northwest Program Director at Defenders of Wildlife. She's a member of Oregon's Environmental Justice Task Force and served on Governor Kate Brown's Environmental Equity Committee. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Washington and a law degree from the University of San Diego Law School. Quinn, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Rosie. And thank you so much to all of the incredible organizers of the Speak for Wolves conference. It is such a privilege to be here with you all today. Although there's a part of me that's like, I can't believe we're doing this virtually for the second year in a row. Thank you so much for just all the work you've done to pivot to this platform and make it such a great and engaging event for so many people. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully this will pop up relatively quickly. Can you all see that first slide?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. So I just have to say, I loved hearing from Anna, the previous speaker. I think this week I was feeling that kind of anxiety-induced paralysis, between the IPCC report about climate change, between, this next wave of COVID, all of these things. And I was really struggling to find that energy to talk about Fish and Wildlife Commission reform. Again, every once in a while I go into these zones where I just think, is what I'm doing, does it matter, right? Why is this important? And it was so lovely to hear Anna talk about, bringing kids and families into nature to have experiences and build connections with our wild places and wildlife. I think what got me kind of re-inspired was going back and looking at photos. And this is one that I put here on the cover. This is my son, Malcolm, at a rally for wolves in Oregon now a couple of years ago. But it's those kinds of connections. It's thinking about the next generation that reminds me that the work is worth it. And I think helps me get eventually jolted out sometimes of those moments of paralysis or stress or anxiety or despair sometimes. So I just want to start with that acknowledgement. I'm sure I'm not alone in those feelings, and just wanted to share that was kind of my headspace this week. I live and work in Portland on the unceded lands of the Chinook, Clackamas, and Cowlitz people. As you know, I'm here today to talk about Fish and Wildlife Commission reform, which is a critically important part of our current system of wildlife conservation and management. But we can't have that conversation without acknowledging that this system is rooted in our country's colonial origins and the exploitation of the people who were the original stewards and protectors of the land and its wildlife. I think it's absolutely worth asking, given these origins, why we would devote so much time and energy to reforming this system. But for those of us who care about protecting wildlife, it's really important that we understand how decisions are made and who is actually making those decisions. We have to increase our understanding so that we can effectively navigate these systems of power so that we can influence and change policy. But we have to understand how these systems came to be so that we can work toward dismantling them and remaking them, in a vision that works for us all today. For those of you who were here last year, a lot of this may be familiar information, but I do want to share that there have been a lot of developments in the last year in this area in both Oregon and Washington. And a lot of those have been really positive developments and a lot of possible evolution to come in the years ahead. So hopefully, even if you were here last year, you'll be able to get some inspiration for the work ahead over the next year or so. So today, authority over wildlife conservation and management in the US is shared between the federal government and the states. In the states, there's generally two models. In one, and it's the model that we have in Oregon and Washington, you have a board or a commission that makes policy decisions and oversees the Fish and Wildlife Agency. And then in the other, you have a political appointee that makes policy decisions and does the overseeing of the agency. But how did the system come to be? We have to look back to the European colonization of North America to really get our answer. All right. So the westward expansion of colonizers in this country was characterized by the brutal genocide of indigenous people and cultures and the completely unfettered exploitation of natural resources. So, and again, this is sort of a snapshot of factors that led up to what we know as our current system of wildlife conservation and management. But as we had this westward expansion, we also had growing urban populations. As those populations grew, we had increased demand for wildlife to feed and dress those populations. But let's be very clear, these wildlife resources weren't destroyed just to meet demand by these urban populations. No, wildlife that represented important cultural resources to indigenous people were specifically targeted and eliminated. It was yet another form of genocide. At the same time, the spread of people and increased development destroyed tremendous amount of habitat. Again, as there was more demand and competition for land, there were active campaigns to eradicate predators like wolves and bears as pests or as competition for game species. By the turn of the 20th century, many species had been pushed to the edge of extinction, or in some cases, over the edge. But there was another trend taking place around this time. As growing populations accumulated wealth, we have the emergence of a middle class and the growth of sport hunting. So this was not subsistence hunting. This was hunting primarily for recreation. This was a way for people with money and leisure time to reclaim some romanticized notion of the frontier spirit. Nonetheless, with this growing form of recreation, we also had a new and vocal and privileged class of advocates, who wanted to protect fish and wildlife and preserve recreational opportunities. So starting in the mid to late 1800s, conservationists, many of whom were sportsmen, began to organize and advocate for the preservation of wilderness areas and wildlife. Here we have an image of the 1909 North American Conservation Congress. And this is a great example of the decision makers behind these early conservation efforts. And I encourage you all to take a very close look at who's represented in this picture and who's not. This was so eye-opening for me. When I first started working in this field, I just sort of took it for granted that this was the system. I didn't realize how intentionally it was designed to exalt certain types of hunting and fishing and certain types of people. My family came to the US as refugees from Vietnam, and fishing is a mode of survival for many refugee and immigrant communities. And this fishing often occurs in polluted and industrialized waterways. But I have never, ever in all my years of attending commission hearings, I have never seen the interests of refugees or immigrants represented at a Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting. I've asked some questions about this to commissioners that have never gotten a satisfactory answer. The closest I got to an explanation was, most of those communities fish in urban waterways, and that's the province more of cities. So very interesting to see how our state fish and wildlife agencies have abdicated their responsibilities to those kinds of communities in favor of recreation. Yet, important laws were passed during this time. including the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Migratory Bird Hunting and Conservation Stamp Act, the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, and the Federal Aid and Sport Fish Restoration Act. So altogether, these pieces of legislation and these efforts laid the foundation for what we know today as the North American model of wildlife conservation. And you can see the 7 central tenets of the model right here on this slide. It's important to know, as often as you may hear it referred to in your work as a wildlife advocate, this model is not legally binding. It is a set of abstract principles that have been built over time. Yet, it forms the basis of our current system of wildlife conservation and management. And it's pretty widely accepted by wildlife professionals and agencies. These efforts all together, there's no doubt, they helped restore populations of species, although mostly game species, species that people wanted to hunt or fish. But we need to acknowledge that this system originated in exploitation and was written by and for sportsmen. I don't mean to insult or denigrate sportsmen and women, but today's wildlife and habitat conservation needs are different, and they call for a different approach. All right. So these next several slides have a lot of words on them, and I'm not going to read them out loud to you. I just want to draw your attention to a few things. Here on this slide, I'd just like you to take a look at the respective mission statements for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. These are the agencies that have primary authority for managing fish and wildlife resources in the Northwest. As you can see, these are first and foremost conservation missions. But even here, you can see how it's skewed by the dynamics we've already discussed. It's conservation for utilization, a very particular kind of utilization. I've heard ODFW's director, Kurt Melcher, refer to sport hunters and anglers as the agency's primary customers. And here it is. So, state fish and wildlife commissions are the supervising authority for each state's fish and wildlife agency. They make rules regarding the conservation and management of state fish and wildlife. They also establish seasons, methods, and bag limits for recreational and commercial hunting and fishing. In both Washington and Oregon, commissioners are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. Beyond the agency's mission, fish and wildlife commissions are often governed by some kind of wildlife policy. You can see that these policies, much like the mission statements, focus first on preventing harm to species and resources. But yet again, you can see that this prevention of harm is linked to protecting recreational and commercial opportunities. I can't tell you how many times we've had to make the legal argument that there are no opportunities if we don't have these co-equal goals, and it is an ongoing challenge.
And is there some feedback issues that are happening right now?
Sorry, what was that?
Are you hearing any feedback issues right now?
No, are you hearing it on your end?
A little bit, yeah.
You know what? Let me try to put on, let me see if putting in my headphones helps. Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, Rosie, is that any better?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds great.
Let me know if that continues to happen. I apologize for that.
No. Thank you so much, Quinn.
Sure. Okay, so on this very, very busy slide, we have a snapshot of the structure for the commissions in each state. One thing I want to note here is that Oregon is in for some major change. As you can see, we currently have 7 commissioners with 1 from each of the states, 5 congressional districts, and then 2 at-large members, 1 from the eastern part of the state, 1 from the western. But with the recent census, Oregon earned a new congressional district. So that means another seat on the commission, and likely one more to ensure that there's an odd number and to reduce the likelihood of tie votes. So I promise you in the year ahead, and we'll be working on redistricting, of course, through the next legislative session, but there's going to be lots of drama around this, and almost certainly lots of legislative shenanigans to try to influence how these additional seats take shape. So keep a close eye on Oregon, because there's going to be a lot of action here, even more than usual. For the most part, though, this is fairly straightforward, right? I mean, we have a structure, we've got geographical restrictions, we've got term limits, all of this. But what does it look like in practice? If you're interested, how do you even go about getting on the commission? If you go to each state's board and commission's website, you'll find, a nice little how-to guide for applying. You can find your application, you can fill it out and submit it. But once you do, it can kind of disappear into the ether. In practice, appointments to Fish and Wildlife Commissions are based on political connections, support or opposition from interest groups, and this, I think, really weird coded language about whether a person is confirmable. Really icky if you start to think about it. It has the essence to me of when people talk about, oh, is this person a good fit or not? What's really meant there? So here's a quick look at Oregon's current commissioners. Again, there's 7, and there will be possibly 9 sometime in the next year. But we fought hard this year for Commissioner Khalil's appointment. And as you can see, Commissioner Woolley's term expired over a year ago. He's been serving an extended term since then, and I think is ready to move on to new things. So we're actively looking for candidates for Congressional District 3. I'll talk about some things that happened over this last year, but we're anticipating, or maybe bracing for, quite a bit of opposition to whoever is nominated for that position. It's going to be interesting. But I do not want to downplay what a big deal it was to get Commissioner Khalil appointed in this really busy, contentious legislative session. With Commissioner Khalil, Chair Wall, Commissioner Woolley, and Commissioner Zarnowitz, we have some folks who are really there ready to prioritize science and who will speak up for conservation. And it's very exciting. We just need to make sure that, when Commissioner Woolley, does step down, when he's able to step down, that we have someone else who can fill that role. And now we have a look at Washington's current commissioners. Now, I work primarily in Oregon. So, for folks who have specific questions about Washington, I am certain there are other people in this conference who can provide some expertise. But like Oregon, since this conference last year, there was great success in getting conservation-minded folks appointed. You can also see that there's currently 1 vacant seat and that Chair Carpenter's term is expired. So again, some more room for change and evolution in Washington. And I want to emphasize what a big deal it is to get someone like Commissioner Smith appointed, to get someone who is, an outspoken advocate for conservation onto this body, to get through all of those hurdles is just an incredible sign of progress. I think it's a reason for hope. We sometimes look to Washington and think, how do they do that? Because I think in Oregon, you almost have to be sneaky. You have to sneak in a conservation candidate, which is the pits. But I want to celebrate what's happened in Washington and really give kudos to all the folks who work so hard to advocate for those appointments. So these are the people who will determine the future of wildlife conservation in Oregon and Washington. We need to pay attention to who they are and how they make their decisions. I want to talk for a moment about marbled murrelets because they provide an excellent case study. So back in 2015, several organizations, the center among them, petitioned to have marbled murrelets listed as endangered under the Oregon Endangered Species Act. The chair of the commission back then told us that uplisting was a no-brainer, and assured us that he would advocate for it among the commissioners. The staff report produced by the agency was really good, actually. It clearly highlighted the threats to the species. But on the day of the hearing, the chair was a no-show. Our supposed advocate just didn't come. After a full day of testimony, the commission tied. No one was satisfied with that. And under the leadership from Commissioner Woolley, they kept debating. And in the end, they voted 4-2 to uplist. It was really exciting. I have to say that was one of the most exciting moments, in my conservation career, but it was sadly short-lived. Just a few months later, there was a hearing in Baker City, pretty far from marbled murrelets habitat in coastal forest. And that hearing was supposed to ratify the uplisting and adopt temporary survival guidelines. Instead, the chair, who didn't bother to show up for the first meeting, essentially allowed a rehearing on uplisting and permitted hours of testimony from timber industry reps and county commissioners. And at the end of that hearing, they reversed their decision. We learned later there was a great series in the Oregonian called Polluted by Money. I encourage you all to read it. That calls out specific timber Democrats for applying pressure to the ODFW director and to commissioners and using the legislative process to push back on the uplisting decision. At a subsequent hearing, when they finally got around to now what were very weakened survival guidelines, the chair threatened to have activists escorted out by the police if they testified on anything that he did not deem to be germane. It resulted in the wildest shouting match I've seen at a commission hearing. It was extremely upsetting. But we sued and we won, right? I mean, the court said, well, this process was bunk. You go back to the drawing board. So indeed, the agency went back. And this time they developed a staff report that left out key science. They left out data. They changed metrics for measuring how the species was doing. And this time they made an explicit recommendation not to uplist. But in the 5 years, since the petition was originally filed, we had almost an entirely new commission. There was only one commissioner who remained from the original hearing, and that was Commissioner Woolley. The hearing this July, it was contentious. It was another long day. But this time, we heard commissioners calling out the agency for leaving out key science. We heard them talking about the precautionary principle and not apologizing for it. We heard them talking about doing the right thing for species, even in the face of uncertainty. It was especially inspiring to see Commissioner Khalil, who's the newest commissioner, talk strongly and fearlessly about the need to protect a species that isn't hunted or fished or trapped in Oregon. And it was her vote that provided the majority to uplist marbled murrelets. So it took years to get new folks on the commission, but it mattered. Every single appointment mattered, and it will continue to matter in the years ahead. So these dynamics that we've been talking about are really baked in at every level. Fish and wildlife conservation funding at the state level is typically characterized as a user pay, user benefit model. But like most state fish and wildlife agencies, ODFW and WDFW have historically received the majority of their funding from hunting and fishing license fees, and federal excise taxes on hunting equipment and fishing gear. This is why hunting and fishing interests are treated and even referred to as the primary customer of the agency. It's also why huntable and fishable species are perceived as the highest priority, and why relatively little resources are devoted to non-game or imperiled wildlife. As taxpayers, this should offend all of us. Participation in hunting and fishing has steadily declined, which has led to
revenue shortfalls. And you can see these charts, which I need to get some more updated ones, but it really shows how participation in hunting and license purchases has declined over the years quite steadily, particularly among younger generations. As a result, ODFW, and I'm less familiar with WDFW, but this is a dynamic that's echoed across the country, has sought significantly more general fund dollars from the public, but it's yet to make that shift to address the public interest in conservation. And, it's tricky, right? Because, I hear a lot of criticism from the hunting and fishing community that, conservationists aren't pulling our weight, that they're the ones who have historically funded conservation. And, you can see from this model that that's true. And yet there has been quite a bit of opposition to finding ways for conservationists to, quote unquote, pay their share. And part of that is because that would also mean sharing some of that power and influence that those constituencies have gotten used to wielding over the years. So it's a very strange period of growing pains, or shrinking pains maybe, for these agencies, but they've got to get caught up. So beyond these, these structural issues, with funding, there's a lot of other things at play here. When we look at our fish and wildlife commissions, and I certainly see this looking at, Washington's commission in particular, there's little to no racial diversity. This should appall us, but perhaps shouldn't surprise us given the origins of this system. Another thing playing into this dynamic is that commissioners are unpaid volunteer positions, meaning that who can afford to do it? People who are retired, people who are financially secure, or have really flexible jobs. But this is why you see so many retired folks on commissions. But that's something playing into the lack of diversity for sure. Another dynamic is that we have special interests driving commission appointments. Though there's nowhere in statute that says this seat is for hunting, this seat is for ranching, because for whatever reason, there's always perceived to be a ranching seat. But in practice, there's this idea, and it's really hard to dislodge, of this one seat per interest group. That's certainly true with Governor Brown's office. This idea that, if we seat a conservation person, well, now we have to balance that with a hunting person or someone who represents commercial fishing. It's kind of an interesting perception there. So then you have interest groups advocating for their people, and that just, again, is another thing that perpetuates this model. And then as a result, you have commissioners who are representing the very interests they're supposed to be regulating. And you have conflicts of interest that are just ignored or downplayed. Another issue is the appointment process is a mystery. I've been working on commission reform for years, and there's still so much of it that is shrouded in just mystery. And it so often seems to be just timing, luck, the whim of a particular person who has the ear of an influential senator. And it can be challenging to navigate. But it's certainly perceived to be based on political connections. And, I haven't seen a lot of evidence to dispel that notion. When the governor's office is so integral to the appointment process, it's hard when your governor is unpredictable or unreliable. We also have this culture that's not conducive to public participation. Commissioners prioritize input from people they perceive as their primary customers. They don't receive any onboarding or training to understand the agency's broad conservation mission or their obligation to the public. So I think it just, again, perpetuates this idea that this agency exists to serve the interests of people who hunt or fish for recreation. So there's all of these other voices who perhaps feel alienated or don't even know that they can and should have a voice in this body. But yeah, I certainly see this at play. I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone that politics takes precedence over science. The marbled murrelet example is a perfect case study there. In Oregon, appointments have been used as political trading stock by the governor and other, senior legislative officials to advance other priorities, which is really tricky. And then this last bit, the job sucks. It's hugely time consuming. This is a rulemaking body. It's not an advisory body. So, their decisions are hugely consequential, but they get very little training. They're not paid for any of their prep time. They're constantly being pinged for meetings with constituents. If they want to do a good job, it is time consuming. And then they're in the spotlight and everyone's always angry at them. Like, I don't know that I would want this job. And again, back to the pay issue, the job it's very hard to do as a true volunteer. It's very hard to do justice's job part-time, which means that only people with lots of time and other sources of income can realistically participate. The good news is that there are lots of opportunities for change. I think the most obvious solution is to scrap the system and start from scratch. And I think there could be some, exciting conversations, with this group about what that could look like, moving forward, what we could build that meets the conservation needs of today. But there are things we can do now to make improvements. Right? One is to prioritize the appointment of people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. We can reject this one seat per interest group model. And this means being vigilant in the legislature, because there's frequently efforts, and there certainly will be in Oregon this year with a new congressional district seat, to try to shift how appointments are made in the commission and to change what it looks like. So being vigilant and making sure that we're keeping this body as inclusive as possible. We want to reject prescriptive appointment criteria. On one hand, it can seem really valuable to say, oh, only people who have direct experience in fish and wildlife management should be allowed to be on the commission. But really, we may be better served by supporting just people who are thoughtful, people who are informed or willing to become informed, who care about conserving fish and wildlife and habitat, folks who will be respectful of public process, who value public process, who will prioritize science, and who reflect the values of the majority of people, in the Northwest who don't hunt or fish. We can also provide adequate onboarding for new commissioners, so they understand the wide variety of interests they must represent. In the absence of that from the agencies themselves, this is we end up providing this informal onboarding, where we get together and talk to new commissioners about our interests, some of the dynamics we've seen. But it'd be nice to see that process more institutionalized and see some leadership from the agencies. We can commit to better representation that reflects the rapidly changing demographics of the region. And certainly we can improve compensation for commissioners. I've actually heard from a couple of commissioners that they would be interested, and I don't think it's, from an equity perspective, in advancing some initiatives to actually compensate people for their time on these bodies. We're asking people to devote a huge amount of energy, and we're simply not compensating them. But we want to enable more people, more members of the public to serve without sacrificing necessary income. And then we can improve transparency around conflicts of interest, and require commissioners to recuse themselves from votes where they have a conflict. So what are we doing? We're doing quite a bit, and it's ongoing work. We're working to engage, empower, and endorse candidates. That means certainly presentations like this, to educate people about the role of the commission, and also to maybe entice people from our conservation community to think about, maybe putting themselves forward as candidates and looking at those opportunities for that kind of service. We want to demystify the process. We're conducting direct outreach to engage community leaders. We're identifying candidates for current and future vacancies, and prioritizing candidates from communities that have historically been marginalized from, in the natural resources management and wildlife conservation communities. We're advocating for improved compensation. I suspect we'll be trying to put forward some concrete legislation in Oregon to this effect. There was a bill this last session that didn't go anywhere, but I think at least kind of got people's attention, got people thinking about it. We want to hold the commission to the same standard, that's being used to transform workplace culture in Oregon's capital, which is to provide a safe and supportive environment for all who work or engage in the commission process. And finally, we're working directly with the governor and her staff and members of the Senate to address these issues and help new candidates gain traction. So this is all well and good, right? I mean, these are important steps. But I can tell you over the last few years, this work has exposed so many challenges and opportunities for growth within the conservation community. I cannot tell you how many times, we've talked, as a community, in a coalition setting, for example, to say, okay, here's a vacancy coming up on the commission. Who do we got? Who do we want to put forward? And it's just crickets, right? No one can think of anyone, or the names that come forward kind of represent more of the status quo. And I think these are opportunities to really look inward and challenge ourselves. It's like looking beyond, okay, what are these steps we can do with decision makers, but what can we do within our own communities and our own networks? So I just want to offer these questions for us to think about, and maybe to challenge some of our assumptions, right? Are we operating reactively or proactively? I can speak for myself. It's almost exclusively reactively. I mean, some of that is just the nature of high volume work, but I think it's also sort of a failure of imagination. It's a failure of our sort of the nonprofit industrial complex workplace culture. We're going to take a lot of time to step back and think about how to work proactively. Are we committed to long-term relationship building, really, really long-term, and building support for BIPOC leaders and youth? Am I, right, too entrenched in the system to think creatively? I mentioned earlier this idea of what would a new system look like? I don't know that I'm the right person to, inform that conversation, because I'm so deep in it. I'm so deep in this system. It's important for us to be able to take those steps back and think about the voices that are needed to come up with a new vision. How diverse are our personal and professional networks? I think this is a really painful one for a lot of people, certainly in Oregon's conservation community. How do our internal and implicit biases influence how we view commissioners or commission candidates? Get back to that, the good fit or the confirmability question. And when you really take a deep dive, what do we mean by that? And how does that permeate how we as individuals think about or perceive people? And I think related to that is, how does the language of the mainstream environmental movement exclude historically underrepresented and marginalized communities? So just a few things for us to be thinking about as we look at, certainly how we can, get great folks and new voices, to fill these current or upcoming vacancies on our commissions, but also what a new system could look like, right? I mean, how we can move beyond what we've got now. So just to wrap up and tie back to our starting place, I want to encourage you all to support organizations that build leadership capacity, certainly among youth and especially among Indigenous communities. One program is the Oregon Lead program, and it's run by NAYA, the Native American Youth and Family Center. They provide in-depth skill building, professional training, and networking opportunities to affirm cultural identity and build a network of Native leaders statewide. You can donate to NAYA to support LEAD and other important programs at their website. And this is maybe an appropriate place to mention that I do not believe Oregon has ever had a commissioner from an Indigenous community. And that's wild, isn't it? We can talk more about that during the Q&A, but this is something we need to change. With that, I'd like to just say thank you, and thank you again to the organizers for putting on another great event. Oh, I do have one quick book recommendation, Rosie, if that's okay. I just finished this book called Beloved Beasts, and it's by Michelle Nijhuis, who is, I believe she's a Pacific Northwest resident, but she's a writer and editor for The Atlantic, for High Country News as well. And, some of this history is here. It's sort of wildlife conservation through the lens of various activists, right? And in some ways it's kind of jarring because it's like, okay, here's these dynamics where this movement has been built by the wealthy, the predominantly white, but it's also very instructive. So I highly encourage folks to take a look at Beloved Beasts.
Thanks so much, Quinn. Sorry, I was just writing that down.
Yeah. I love a good book recommendation.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, we do have some questions if we want to just get right in it. And first of all, it's always wonderful to see you and hear you and just be in your presence and to share this space with you. Truly a phenomenal human. And it's just wonderful to see you here. So thank you for being a part of our conference this year.
I feel the same about you and all of the organizers. You're all fantastic. Thank you.
So, since we finished on the topic of more Indigenous and Native voices being heard, has there been an intentional effort to reach out to Native Indigenous individuals to be a part of the commission from ODF&W?
To the extent that it's happening, it is largely individual, right? There is not a concerted effort. And again, this goes to sort of the mystery of the commission appointment process, because it's kind of up to individuals across the board. Now, I can tell you that Commissioner Woolley, who is looking at who's going to take over for him, has been working really hard to encourage outreach to Indigenous communities. Now, one of the excuses I have heard, and this came from, I think it was Director Melcher at one point, and I don't think it was in the context of commission appointments, but there was the question of how to include tribal governments as stakeholders when you start dealing with these intergovernmental issues. And so I think for a lot of people that translated to, oh, that's an issue for the commission as well. Now there's something there, but it's not the whole story, right? So the key is that, and this was, I believe, some information I got from Commissioner Woolley, if an individual is representing a tribal government, that's maybe where things get perhaps a little bit tricky. If they are there in their individual capacity, which frankly, commissioners are supposed to be, they're supposed to represent the interests of the whole state, it's less of an issue. So I think there's been, frankly, a lot of excuses made about the complications that's to kind of cover up just lack of outreach and relationship building. So there is an effort, again, by specific individuals in the governor's office and by this outgoing commissioner to do that outreach, but it is absolutely not institutionalized. It's not something that is being led by the agency for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
More on one, kind of in conjunction with what we were just talking about, and on one of the topics that you covered, the improved transparency about conflicts of interest. It's interesting that that's not institutionalized. However, there are hunters and trappers on the commission that do indeed have conflicts of interest when it comes to some of these policies that they are implementing. Can you divulge more on that? What would that look like?
Yeah, one of the most blatant or troubling conflicts of interest had to do with wolves. It was, a few years ago when Oregon was updating its wolf plan. And one of the commissioners was married to the primary lobbyist for the Oregon Hunters Association and was getting testimony from her husband. And there were many hearings in which that relationship, that potential conflict was not disclosed. Now, eventually, under quite a bit of public pressure, there was sort of a, okay, yes, here's the relationship, but there was no recusal from the actual vote. So, we did some looking, and consulted the Attorney General. And the hard thing, right, is that conflict of interest can be construed very narrowly. So if it's construed as, you will receive a financial benefit from this decision, all of a sudden the world of conflict becomes much, much smaller. And in this case, the conclusion was, well, okay, well, perhaps, this person's individual perspective might be skewed by seeing her spouse as one of the primary advocates for on the wolf plan. But is she or is he receiving a financial benefit? So much less clear. So I think, I don't know what it would take to change those conflict of interest laws, but I think interpreting them more broadly, in the marbled murrelet hearing, Commissioner Zarnowitz, completely of her own accord, we didn't even know this, said, hey, I need to let everyone know that, my husband has done research on marbled murrelet, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was kind of refreshing to just see that put out in the open. So even if it doesn't result in, a recusal from votes, which I think, frankly, would take quite an extreme or obvious conflict, I think we should encourage that kind of transparency. Like, this is how I've been involved, or these are the things that influence my perspective. I think that's honest. We're all we're all people. We're all influenced by various things. But I think hiding it creates some weird dynamics.
Definitely.
Yeah. Ideally, though, we'd be able to say, hey, for this is a vote in which you should step aside.
Speaking of that, how open is ODF&W to hearing these suggestions to reforming treatment of commissioners and these types of stipulations like transparency?
The agency itself, no. The commissioners, and this is where we get to sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? The more you get open-minded folks who really want to think about making these bodies more functional, appointed, the more you can have these conversations. But with the folks we've got now, in Oregon's commission, for example, with Chair Wall, with Commissioner Khalil, certainly with Commissioner Woolley, you have folks, and one in the leadership position, who are very, very open, who are open to having conversations, who you can say, well, this didn't work. What can we do next time? So I have not found a lot of receptivity in the agency, which again, it's very, very mired in old ways, which is the benefit of having a commission that doesn't just come from, retired Fish and Wildlife, agency staff. It's people who represent broad interests, across the region. So I'm starting to see more interest. I think some of these commissioners too are just like, this doesn't work. Why are we doing it this way? But it also takes a lot of relationship building and a lot of communication over time to have that trust and to be able to have those conversations.
It's an archaic system that needs to be brought into the modern world.
Yes.
Speaking of that, it's a compliment mixed with a question, a great analysis of Fish and Wildlife Commission problems. But how do we engage the state and fish and wildlife agencies to promote these types of changes?
Man, this is the question, right? This is really it. And to affect some of these big dynamics, this is kind of the question. So for example, in Oregon, it's kind of this, there's not one panacea, right? It's a bunch of people working on different angles of this thing, trying to get, no one person, no one group can do it all. but we've got folks who are working specifically on how do we fund an agency that how do we fund this agency in a way that is sane? And that's reflective, right? If you're asking for more of our money as taxpayers, how are our interests being reflected? So this last year, the Oregon Conservation and Rec Fund got more funding, which is exciting. I mean, it's sort of it's a bucket of money set aside for community conservation projects. So there's like little things, right, where they're starting to move. And I think you get this interesting momentum where you get a program like that, people get excited about it. They see the agency, wow, you gave, $5,000 to fund this community-led project that had nothing to do with game species. That's exciting. Wait, what else are you doing? Maybe I now want to. So you get a little bit of the snowball effect.
Yeah.
I think so. But the funding thing is a big issue. Certainly, commission appointments are a piece of it. I think engaging on a spectrum of issues within these agencies. It's very easy to kind of focus in on our passion projects. Like, this is where I'm going to engage with the agency. But I think thinking creatively too about, well, okay, they're also working on this interesting habitat or property acquisition. How does that relate to the things that I really care about and being heard there? So I think just finding ways to get involved and increase understanding. But, this ties into this larger dynamic in the conservation world, right? Where there's this unspoken hierarchy of conservation issues. And this has been certainly true in my legislative work, right? Where the perception is, well, we've got bandwidth to do a handful of things. And what's on fire? What's literally on fire right now? And where do we direct our attention? And so often wildlife falls to the bottom of that pile. It gets used as trading stock. So I think that's where, frankly, it's one of the things that's so powerful about wolf advocacy, right? Because it's one of those issues that cuts through. When ODFW decided to kill wolf pups, like that, it cuts through, right? It reminds people that this stuff is happening. So it's all of us in continuing to elevate these things, not just with the agency, though that's certainly true, but with legislators. Like, say, this is not an issue you get to trade. The governor needs to understand that she doesn't get to trade wolves for a transportation package that she didn't get passed anyway. It's being present and continuing to give voice to this issue to try to get at this, and I hate using that hierarchy thing. It just feels like that. I do often feel the truth of that in my work. And, again, to get down to this long-term thing that, Anna was talking about earlier, it's, we're advocating for today, but how are we also nurturing the next generation of voices who are going to make sure that this stays in the public view?
Speaking of,
sorry, that was a huge answer.
No, that was great. Steph's clapping her hands. I don't know if you can see the reactions. That was great. More on that. There's a question. Are there talking points or specific coalition of people that are working on this reform? Are there resources that you can point people to encourage support of commission reform? Or is it just get involved, keep up to date, or is there an actual coalition working towards this?
In Oregon, there's the Oregon Wildlife Coalition, and you can certainly find information out if you just Google it, and you can find information and get in touch with us there. And that's a priority for that coalition. I know there have been some nascent efforts in Washington to do that, but I know it's also been an issue for, there's some informal coalitions, that are just working on this issue. I know Pacific Wolf Coalition cares deeply about commission reform. So lots of different groups thinking about it. But is there a way to share resources with attendees of this conference that, like, after the fact?
I believe that we can, yes. And Steph actually just put the Oregon Wildlife
Thank you,
Coalition in the chat as well for people to to look into as well. But those are great resources.
Yeah, and I can share a couple of, we've got some written resources for activists about this that we can share, and I can also send that to you guys.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Quinn. So another question, do you recommend buying a hunting license so I can call myself a hunter, and would I then have more of a voice that is heard?
Yeah, I have to say, I love that, because it's so, and I have mixed feelings about it, right? But I've been at so many commission hearings where I have literally seen these people come up and say, if you don't have one of these, and they wave their hunting license around, you don't pay for this, you don't get a voice. I mean, frankly, I think you should just waive your tax returns.
Yeah. But have you seen in this commission that that's more heavily weighed, the like hunters and farmers and fishers? Do you see that their voice is more heard than conservationists or scientists?
For sure. But again, it's so baked in, right? I mean, these are the origins of these agencies. So in some ways, on one hand, like, I love the sort of symbolic or the power of being like, you want me to buy in? Here it is. One thing I worry about is, are we then sort of inadvertently playing into this narrative or this perception that the only customer here is the hunter, the trapper, the angler, versus I too am a customer. Like, I'm one of your constituents. I'm a taxpayer. If you want more of my money, which you do, you need to be doing things that I care about. So I think it's really, it's things like, go to a wildlife refuge, though. Pay your entrance fee. Go to one of the state-owned refuges, and pay your $5, fee for the day, and bring that, say, this is how I want to, these are the kinds of things I want to support. So, well, on one hand, I like I said, would kind of love to see that.
It's interesting. That's a very interesting perspective. In Colorado, one way that we're moving around that with the reintroduction of wolves, so hunters and anglers can't say, nothing against hunters and anglers, but they can't necessarily say that they funded the reintroduction of wolves, is that there is, when you register your car at the DMV, there's a certain charge that you can either opt out of in order to not fund that. But it's not just specifically for wolves, it's for imperiled species in the state of Colorado. So integrating that aspect, that it's going to be funded by the entire public and not just with hunting and angling dollars as well. So I think that's a great way around that, and maybe, fingers crossed, something that will be more adopted throughout the state. But our governor is a little bit more, how do I say, welcoming and friendlier to wildlife.
Willing to take a stronger stand, yes.
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
For sure. I love that, by the way. I think that's such a cool program.
Wonderful way to use some money in that
exactly.
way. Yes, I'm just looking over the question, and I think that is it. Quinn, how can people learn more about what you are doing with the Center for Biological Diversity and to keep up to date with commission reform?
Yes, please do. I'm on my last slide. I had my email address. Please feel free to reach out. Definitely look into the Oregon Wildlife Coalition, because that group is working really closely together. Lots of members of that coalition, we're speaking here today. I think you heard from Shristi Kamal already. Yeah, yesterday. And Zoe Hanley, and so we're all working really closely together on these issues. But certainly with Oregon, if you go to that webpage, email some of us, we'll keep you up to date on what's happening, because it's going to be spicy. The next legislative.
Quinn, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to have you at Speak for Wolves, and it's always wonderful to share space with you. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and what you continue to do.
Likewise, and thank you all just for the great energy and the inspiration. I needed it this week. So thank you very much.
Thanks.